the newsagents.
Okay, well, that was a good start. The studio is currently covered with champagne.
This
I'm going to
didn't go
lean
quite
over.
according to plan.
No.
Hang on.
Turns out the studio wasn't really made for leaning
we've got a
over.
chink.
Chink. Okay.
Hang on, how are we going to get there?
I'm
Go
going to
on.
have to simulate this. I feel like this hasn't gone very well.
Cheers.
Cheers.
We've now got a studio where the floor is covered in champagne. I've got champagne all over my trousers, and popping that cork
Just a typical Wednesday, really.
turned out to be a little more complicated and stressful than I thought it might be.
It's just a normal day in the newsagents HQ for you, isn't it, John?
Well, normally we have the bottle of champagne before we go on air, but we've decided to bring the bottle of champagne into the studio to uncork it to mark our first birthday.
It is our first birthday. A year ago today, the newsagents was born. And to celebrate, we thought we would do something we've never done before. Certain other podcasts rather unimaginatively do it every single week, I'm told.
Do they really?
Yeah, well, you know what, John? Some people have got very little imagination. But we thought for one day only, we would turn things over to you to ask questions to us about politics, the year ahead, the year just gone, and also a little bit about the show itself. And indeed, we have got one question just to kick us off, John, which is very, very germane to you. And it says, it's from Luke. And Luke says, "Hi, have loved the show since the early days, but I really want to know who swears more, Maitlis or Sopel. Almost fell off my chair when I first heard her curse, but thinking about it, she does seem like she has a sailor's mouth when she gets going. Best, and I'm sorry, Mother, I know you don't like me. I'm just quoting something here. Best fucking regards, Luke."
Well, obviously, Maitlis is far more inappropriate in her use of language, and I can say that confidently because she's not here to defend herself. So I'm going to say it's entirely Maitlis. I am an innocent in all of this. Occasionally, I have lapsed into a little bit of... Occasionally, just every now and then.
More of this to come. Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
And it's Lewis.
And we're at Newsagents HQ. And we've got cake and we've got champagne and but we're not going to make this entirely self-congratulatory. Obviously, quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, why change the habit of a whole year?
Exactly. Well, no, but it has been kind of quite a journey where you start with 0 subscribers and you hope that you're going to grow some over the course of the year, and we have. And I tell you, one of the things that has amazed me when we kind of put out a pitch, please get in touch if you've got any thoughts, is just how many people say they have listened to every episode.
You sad cases.
Yeah. Now, your mum, I would expect it.
Yeah.
Mrs. Sopel, maybe. Most episodes, I would hope so.
Yeah.
But the rest of you, well,
Mrs. Goodall
thank you
has.
for...
Not that she calls herself that, but she's listened to everyone, John.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. She might have stopped now we're actually married. It may have just been a sort of pre-wedding thing. But now she has, yeah.
Oh,
we should. I was thinking maybe we should get a little badge for people.
What, the 100%
The
club?
100% Club. Yeah. We are the 100%.
It's sort of like, could be like a Blue Peter badge, except it's for
Less
newsagents.
Yeah.
No, this will be cooler.
Well, yeah. So we've got a mix of fun questions, but also serious questions about politics and the year ahead. And so we should kick off with this one, which is from Alex, which says, "Hi, newsagents." I love having just a glass of something in the hand when we do this. This could be a new development for the year ahead. "Hi, newsagents. Happy birthday. Love the podcast. I've listened to every episode so far." So Alex is 100%er. "My question is, does media reporting around assumptions that the Conservatives will lose the next election pose a risk to Labour's chances of victory?"
Well, I think that if everybody just got into the mindset that it's all a done deal, then that would be extremely dangerous for Labour and extremely stupid of the media. And, you know, we've talked a lot about whether what we're about to see is a repeat of the 1997 election and whether Keir Starmer's on course for this massive landslide or whether it's going to be more like 2010 where you might get a hung parliament. Look, you have to go with what the evidence is as you see it at any given moment and what the trend seems to be. And the trend seems to be that Rishi Sunak is not closing the gap on Keir Starmer. But do I think we're in the same territory as we were in 96, 97, where it was clear that the British people had made up their mind on the Conservatives, made up their mind on John Major, really liked Tony Blair, who was sort of charismatic and offering something that seemed quite new and quite exciting? I don't think we're at that phase yet.
I mean, obviously, I was a bit young to really remember that period, John, because I was only, I think, 6, 7. But I mean, was there no, at the time, because one of the things I was going to say in answer to this question is, one of the reasons the media, we like a horse race, right? It's far more interesting in terms of the coverage of going into an election, of saying, well, this might be more of a contest than you think. Now, I happen to think that for the reasons you just said, actually, sometimes you've got to take a step back and look at the fundamentals. The fact of the matter is the Conservatives haven't been ahead in one single poll since 2021. Generally speaking, they're between 20 and 25 points behind. Sunak has not managed to arrest the decline. And you will hear a lot more about the kind of idea of Sunak making a return or maybe denting the Labour lead and so on. But actually, so much of that is about the narrative. It's about the media needing a horse race. Was that not around at all in before 97, even a little bit? The idea that, because they'd lost so many times and that maybe and the Tories were still such a machine. Was it not around at all?
So I think there was. I think at the top of the Labour Party and the people around Blair who were pivotal at that time, Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson, a few others, Philip Gould, they were very concerned that nothing could be taken for granted. But you just saw the evidence that was building up and it just seemed inconceivable. I mean, I think it seemed inconceivable that Labour would lose the election. I don't think people had quite foreseen the scale of the landslide. And I remember on the day of polling itself, speaking to one or two Labour people who were really nervous about victory and were kind of still saying you've got to get out every vote, you can't take a thing for granted. And Blair was very superstitious on that, thinking, nothing is done. And I think it was a shock to them when they won by the margin that they did. There was some polling that was taken afterwards, which I thought was, again, really interesting as a sort of psychological study. That they did some polling where it was something like 1 million more people claimed to have voted Labour than actually did, because people wanted to ally themselves with that success. And you just felt that the Tories just didn't know how to attack the Labour Party after 17 years in rule, whether Tony Blair was this kind of red in tooth and claw, there was the demon eyes advert for Blair, or whether they were a kind of just a bunch of idiots who didn't know what they were doing. Yeah,
well, I think that ultimately the biggest danger now for Starmer and for the Labour Party isn't really about the election. Anything could happen, but isn't necessarily about the election. It was what happens after. Because actually, probably unlike 97, actually, partly because the macroeconomic and the political situation is so much worse now, it seems to me the Labour Party, the biggest problems they're going to have is when they try and govern. And the thinking by comparison to pre-97 on all sorts of areas, just like let's take small boats, for example, just isn't there. It just isn't there. And because there's not going to be any great love for the Labour Party, unlike 97 as well, you can imagine a Labour government running into the sand, particularly if the majority is not very big or there's no majority at all, very, very quickly. More prosaic question we've got here, more about us rather than about politics, which is from Ubaid, who says, very pithily, "Where the hell is Emily? I miss her." That's something we've asked ourselves.
It's obviously we've been bereft and kind of it's been quiet. We haven't had Moody.
We haven't had Moody the dog. We haven't had any singing.
Surely she's recorded a voice note singing us happy birthday.
Hello everyone, it's Emily. I'm in the back of a car with a dog sprawled across my lap, somewhere near Orleans, and my sons are beside me shouting "sacked in the morning," which is either a response to the football scores they're going through overnight because we finally got a signal, or else it's about me having been off work for so long and heading back as fast as I possibly can now to Newsagents HQ because I've missed you lot and it's time to re-engage my brain. Can't wait to be back with everyone.
And that was Maitlis from the car somewhere on the way back to London, and she's going to be back in the studio again next Monday. Hurrah! So we will look forward to seeing her then. We've had this lovely note from Lois, and let me just read it to you. Just wanted to say thank you so much for your wonderful podcast. Your first episode aired just after the breakdown of a serious relationship, and I used to really look forward to those 30 minutes a day during those dark months when I could escape my thoughts and listen to your witty and fantastic news coverage. 1 year on, I've moved city, got my own place, feel like myself again, and still listen to your podcast every night whilst I cook dinner.
Oh.
That's really sweet. Did the newsagents cure my heartbreak? Well, who's to say it didn't?
Who needs relate when you've got the newsagents?
Yeah. So, to the question from Lois, which news event have you covered on the podcast that you think your past selves from 12 months ago would least likely believe really happened?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I
Wow.
mean, there's so many, aren't there? I mean, the obvious one is the idea of a 45-day, 50-day premiership.
Yes.
I mean, when we literally started the show just at the Johnson Trust handover. Queen died. And it wasn't even a 50-day premiership. In reality, it was like a 2.5-week, 3-week premiership because everybody shut down during the period of national mourning. I mean, I just don't think, I don't know about you, but the sheer speed, it's become cliche to talk about how fast everything in politics now is. That was off the scale, and I don't think we will ever see anything like it again.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? That, honestly, hand on heart, Liz Truss is the person I would sort of most like to interview on the podcast, because I'd love to hear her reflections of what it must feel like, because she is the punchline to a joke now of it's a source of comedy. I mean, less so if mortgage costs have gone up as a result of the kind of crazy budget that she introduced. But I think that was a most extraordinary period. Also, I think that, we hadn't anticipated that we would be dealing with the Queen's death. And I think that actually the episode we did where we reflected on that was also interesting, where I don't think our past selves at the BBC would have been able to say the sort of things we said. Not that they were anti-Elizabeth or anti-monarchy, or they were just reflective of a way that I think the rest of the media had got into a tone of voice that was just hushed. And, let's not say anything interesting or controversial. And I think we kind of explored some of the more controversial aspects to it. And I think that I wouldn't have anticipated that.
So my understanding is that Emily has reached the Persephonica around Paris at the moment, and she's just sent us her thoughts on this from there.
It was a political year, not without its surprises. I think we had about one a day for the first 6 weeks we were on air. But I would say, if you're going for the unexpected, it would be everything that's happened with the SNP in the last 6-7 months. The resignation of Nicola Sturgeon, I remember that left me jaw-dropped, trying to understand what it was. The blue forensic evidence tent in her garden, didn't have that one on my bingo card. So, yeah, I'd say that has been the sort of, maybe the longest standing shift that I really didn't see coming.
That's actually wrong. She was in a Eurotunnel, I think.
I'm really concerned that Emily's kids have just put her in the boot. And that Emily was there broadcasting
by the border
from the boot of the car, because the sound quality was completely different than when it was all very languid. The dog was on her lap. It was all very nice. The kids were sitting next to her reading the football scores.
Well, I'm sure one way or the other she'd have been in her sunglasses doing it one way or the other. We've got another one here saying, I like this one. This is from Will Channel. Says, you have a baby boomer host, you have a Gen X host, and you have a millennial host. Would you guys consider getting a Gen Z host? Also, I think you should bury the hatchet and do a once-a-year charity crossover with the rest is politics. Well, they are a charity, aren't they, in many ways, Will? So I don't think that's really necessary. It's a bit unfair on you, isn't it, John? I mean, you're greatest generation rather than boomer, aren't you?
No, shut up. That's so cruel. The greatest generation.
You and Biden?
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
it's the greatest generation. Those are the sort of values I associate you with.
I think it's been good that there has been a mix of, I think that we do have maybe generational outlooks that are different. I mean, we had a discussion yesterday about cars, cities, and, I think that there was a sort of generational difference between us. But I think I think what's interesting is that actually the differences in standpoint are for all sorts of reasons. And none of us quite conform to any stereotype. And I think, hopefully, that's what makes this podcast work, because we can laugh at each other as well as agree with each other.
Well, this one from Maria Luck follows quite nicely on that. It says, with demographic challenges expected to only worsen in the UK, this follows from some of the shows that we've done on childcare costs and renting and all that sort of student debt. Should the next government consider introducing a Minister of State for Intergenerational Fairness, a brief that would cover issues like housing and debt, but also the right to a future healthy climate?
I think that's a really interesting idea. I think that it is one of the huge social problems / challenges. We've talked about the triple lock on pensions, and you realise how much of public policy is skewed towards the elderly who probably might need it least, because they are the people who vote the most, and therefore you want to keep that particular demographic happy when, you know, they've probably built up maybe considerable value in the properties that they own, whereas for a kid to get on the housing ladder now, certainly when I was buying my first property, you know, and I was working in Southampton and I could bought a place in Winchester, it was quite, there was affordability. It was something like, you know, 3 times my salary of the house that I bought. Whereas, you know, if you're working in London and you are even a young professional, you are not going to be earning enough to buy your own place in London that's 3 times your income.
Well, not least when you're basically probably spending anywhere between 35 and 50% of your income on tax when you add all the different taxes
and your
together,
student debt,
including your student debt, exactly, which is effectively a tax, which is something we've talked about before. I actually think this is one of the. I think intergenerational fairness should be one of the prisms through which we see politics in a way that we have started. Rightly, in lots of ways, looking at lots of other structural injustices in our society, whether it's racial, whether it's between the sexes, between men and women, whether it's class, because actually these things all fuse, particularly, I mean, basically, actually, arguably, generations to some extent, not completely, obviously, because you still get rich people within generations, but actually generations, in a sense, is the new class structure, partly because of the property question, or largely because of the property question, pension questions as well, that you described, John. And until we start looking at it in that way, we'll never get anywhere. What irritates me most, because I do LBC sometimes and sometimes talk about these questions around intergenerational unfairness, what I think is the problem is not so much the view that you've just described, because you've been very self-aware. You're like, well, you know, it was easier in this regard when I was younger, and no one's going to be irritated by that. That was just the situation at the time. Why should no one should be punished for that just because it was slightly easier then. The problem so often in British politics is there is a whole cohort of voters, older voters, who don't really seem to want to acknowledge that. They find it sort of almost psychologically insulting when you say, actually, it was harder. It is harder now than it was then. And they come back at you saying, well, we had 17% interest rates, this, that and the other. No, it's different because house prices were much cheaper then. And that's one of the biggest problems. Very few people ever seem to want to ever accept that they had it easier. Not that they had it easy, because no one really ever has it completely easy, but they had it easier. And we need politically to recognise that and start doing something about it.
It's interesting. In the US, sociologists talk a lot about transgenerational mobility. And that is the sort of one of the fundamental underpinnings of the American dream, that you will work hard, and as a result of your hard work, you will lead a better life than your parents before you. And that has sustained generation after generation, believing that with their endeavours, they will make a better life, they will have a bigger house, they will have a bigger car, their kids will go to better schools, and their kids will do well, and they will get better. And I think that actually one of the huge shocks, and we talk about the rise of populism kind of that's happened, you know, in Europe, in the United States with the election of Trump in 2016, was the shock of the sort of 2008 financial crisis, where people thought that a steel factory would be shuttered for a few weeks and then reopen at the end of the recession, and it didn't. And I think there is now a real issue about transgenerational mobility, that the next generation are not going to be better off than their parents. They're going to find it a whole lot tougher. And the idea of this endless kind of movement of social mobility, that the only way is up, is wrong.
Any to answer Will's question? Any Gen Z hosts you can think of? Greta, get Greta in. You and her.
You and Greta, we do very well together.
Yeah, you do very, very well. Yeah.
Which brings us to the next question.
Oh, I like this one.
And this isn't
going to cause any problems, is it? No.
It's from Richard. What's the issue that the 3 newsagents most clearly hold different opinions on?
I think we should just hand over to Emily, who's just crossed into Dover, shall we?
Yeah.
What do the newsagents disagree on? Okay, let me try and take you, as we say, behind the curtain. There are some areas that I think we've kind of debated quite frankly on air, like the Just Stop Oil, whether it achieves its means, whether it's the right way to achieve your means. I would also say levelling up versus levelling up and down, i.e. whether you want to raise everyone up or whether you want to sort of bring the top down to raise the bottom up. That's been a sort of debate, but every morning we have a kind of, Zoom call, and we bash a few ideas backwards and forwards, and we sometimes disagree on the people that we should have on the show. And I think that the most successful ones actually are when we don't know that we disagree until we get on air. Oh, and the last thing we disagree on is football, actually, because Lewis, I think, would, in a perfect world, never mention football on the newsagents. And Jon would mention Spurs every day, at least once, on the newsagents. And on the morning after a penalty shootout in which Spurs lost to Fulham, my boys' team, I think we should probably give everyone an honourable mention. Let's see if Jon disagrees.
Little does she know that yesterday, for reasons that need not detain our listeners, I went down an absolute rabbit hole, Wikipedia rabbit hole, where I started sort of researching quite extensively the Surinamese national football team and all of their most recent history. So she knows. That was nice. You enjoyed that, didn't you, Jon?
It was the most extraordinary excursion where we were trying to record. We sat down here. We want to get the recording underway. And Lewis suddenly becomes obsessed with Suriname. What the main export is, what the main import is, what the balance of trade is. And then someone says, oh, Suriname footballers. Well, they're probably in the Dutch team. And then we start going down and we lose minutes and minutes and minutes.
This is why we need Emily back.
Yeah, this is why we need Emily back. But I'm not even going to dignify any comment over the penalty shootout at Craven Cottage last night where Ange Postecoglou's boys came a little bit unstuck.
Entirely seriously for a moment, I actually think the kind of political differences between us, and obviously we're not here necessarily to explore what we think about everything. We're here always to do the news. But obviously something we can do now is bring a little bit more, because we're all so deeply captivated by politics.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that unites us. And actually, I think, although some people might, I see sometimes criticise us saying, oh, we all think the same thing, or, you know, sort of liberal, all this sort of stuff. And although, obviously, I would say probably there is truth in the idea of us all being sort of liberal in some sense, I actually think our politics is quite different in quite interesting ways that does come out on the show.
Yeah.
And whether that's generational, whether it's about left right, and the extent to which we're sort of different on that, and all those sort of things. I actually think that's one of the interesting things that keeps us going.
And because people are more complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is what I kind of can't stand about. Well, you're all a bunch of liberal woke lefties. You know, I feel very illiberal about all sorts of issues. Yeah. I'm not at all woke on some issues, but if woke means being kind of sensitive to other people around you.
I don't think Just Stop Oil think you're that woke, do they, Jon?
Yeah. I mean, you know, and there are things where you debate and think, is this effective policy or is it counterproductive? And I'm just asking these questions from a political analysis point of view of what works and what doesn't work. You're going to have another sip of champagne.
Well, we're about to have a break, so I'm going to have a sip of the champagne. I don't really usually like champagne, but given it's a special occasion, why not?
We'll be back after the break. Lewis will be sozzled. Welcome back. And if you're just joining us, well, you won't be just joining us. No, actually, we mustn't say welcome back.
Oh, yeah, someone complained.
Someone complained about welcome back, and I think it's a good complaint. Why do you think we've gone anywhere, this person?
We're still here.
We're still here, so why are you saying welcome back?
We haven't gone anywhere.
No.
It's true. So no more welcome back. It's on the ban list.
Oh, should we just say, we're still here?
We're still here. Right up to the point we're not. Amy has sent a question in saying, happy first birthday. I've listened to every episode. 100% Club Amy. Your podcast has given me something to look forward to each day whilst I battle a very difficult and different world of parenting children with special educational needs and disabilities. I don't speak to grown-ups much, and listening feels I'm on a team lunch having a gossip. That is lovely. So she says she lives in Birmingham, and difficulty with the Labour-run council there and her situation with her kids. And she says that maybe there is, like a lot of British politics, too much discussion about London, and then politics in the other great cities of the UK get a bit lost. Is that fair, do you think? Are we a bit too London-centric? We try not to be. I mean, we've done quite a bit of reporting from Birmingham, and my home city, of course, but we've done and other cities, but we could always do more.
I think it's always a balance that's got to be struck, and I was very conscious of this when I was at the BBC, where they'd say, right, far too much of the output is coming from London. We need to have studios in Salford or Glasgow or Cardiff or whatever. And you think, well, yeah, of course, absolutely. But London is the capital city, and there is a reason for that, and it's the economic powerhouse and all the rest of it. I think that if we become too Westminster focused and don't understand enough about how some things apply to the rest of the country, that is where we can lose sight of things and become very narrow and myopic in our outlook. And I think that probably, there is, we're sitting here in London. Our studio is in London. I kind of don't think it's, well, why don't the newsagents present the show today from Middlesbrough? I mean, why it becomes tokenistic if you're just going there for the day. But I think we've got to be very conscious that not everybody is London, thinks like London, is metropolitan like London. And, and that's why, one of the episodes that caused us some grief was when we interviewed Jeremy Clarkson. I should say we interviewed him before he made his comments about Meghan Markle. But, why are you interviewing Jeremy Clarkson? Well, I think he had an interesting view on rural life, which is something as well that doesn't get covered that much.
No, and it's true. So much of the because Britain is quite unusual, or at least it's unusual compared to, say, the United States or some countries like Germany, where all of our political power and media power are all centred in one place, not just one city, but like one bit of the city, effectively. And that does just inevitably alter the way you cover things and how you think about things. And it's always our job, and something I've always tried to do is to resist that as much as you possibly can, and get out and about and travel as much as possible and talk to people as much as possible, which I think we do try and do. But I also think it's difficult in a way when you are doing stories that are inherently local. Like, in a way, when GB News started, part of their whole shtick initially was, we're going to do two things. We're going to be kind of basically the voice of the right in the British media, because it's underrepresented, which they're still doing. And their other thing is, we're going to do loads of local news. And it's quite striking how quickly they pivoted away from that, because the truth is, local news is, of course, always massively important, but inevitably it is by definition local. And if you don't live there, you're not going to care about it very much. That's not to say that we don't do big things in Birmingham and Manchester and all that sort of thing, those sort of things. But it is difficult sometimes to do local when you're doing national at the same time.
Okay. We're going to move from provincialism to nutrition now. Hiya, this is from Albert Davis Smith in Cardiff. I really love the newsagents, and a very happy first birthday. I think I heard Lewis mention on the podcast once that he has a no lunch policy, and it's been playing on my mind ever since. Could you discuss this further?
Oh, Albert, you've got nothing else to think about. I can put Albert's mind at rest, or maybe I can't. It is true. I have a no lunch policy. I might have a item of fruit. This is, by the way, I'm not alone in this. Right up to and including His Majesty the King also has a no lunch policy. So I'm in very good company. One of the many similarities between Charles and myself.
It's striking how often I think that you two are interchangeable.
I love the newsagents. It's one of my favourite podcasts. Wonderful, much better than that very rude Alistair man. Yeah, I do, because I think lunch is just the worst meal. It's just at least as it is in Britain.
Wrong.
No.
You spent a year living in France. How could you think that?
Well,
lunch is the worst meal?
I did in France, and I didn't like. I put on weight in France. Not too much, but yeah, I had to come back and cut all that out. But mainly because of the desserts. I do have a sweet tooth. But the problem is with lunch in Britain anyway. You're right. In France, it's gorgeous. You can have a proper meal. It's wonderful. In Britain, basically, you got Pret, no offence to Pret, or wherever it happens to be. It's basically always just like a sandwich, or like, something just deep in. People just eat it really quickly. So my preference is to have my 1970s breakfast. My wife called me a 1970s man in terms of my diet, because I have my black pudding and eggs and my...
You have black pudding and eggs?
Yeah, for breakfast.
Yeah. Every morning?
All boiled eggs, yeah. Yeah, and I have
but
a big
always
breakfast.
Have black pudding?
No, I don't always... I always have eggs. and I often have black pudding, yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're learning more and more here.
And then
Bacon,
I have a big breakfast,
sausages,
and then,
mushrooms.
No, just that. And then I have a big breakfast, and then I don't really have much for lunch, and then have a reasonable sized dinner.
But you see, the argument
I
is...
deal with offal. Love offal.
Oh, yeah. The argument is that if you eat at lunchtime,
I know,
and have a good lunch, and then you don't eat so much in the evening,
I know,
that is much
better.
Healthier for your digestive system and your gut. And all the
but
rest
you
of
do
it.
sort of effectively have a little mini fast in the day, which is also good for you. So I think it sort of balances out if you don't have lunch.
Now, you see, I am.
I also think if you have lunch, you would just get really bloated. Did you ever, were you still as a part of the pre-war generation, you remember the days of drinking heavily, journalists drinking heavily.
Oh my
you still
God.
have that?
I remember that vividly.
Really?
Yeah.
So
Nightmare.
even in the 80s, and that was in the 90s, that was still...
Yes.
I suppose particularly in Westminster, you'd have been doing it all the time as well.
Well, at Westminster, the culture was you'd go out for lunch, you would have a bottle or two of wine, and then go back to the lobby afterwards,
Yeah.
where all I wanted to do was sleep the
Yeah.
afternoon away because I can't drink at lunchtime. But yeah, and then when I first went to work at Broadcasting House, this is in the 80s, it was absolutely, you'd go to the Hat and Stick, the Crown and Scepter pub, and you'd have 3 or 4 pints, or you'd go to the Yorkshire Grey.
Still there?
They're still there. They're both pubs, I
still
think, are
there,
still
actually,
there.
yeah.
And you'd drink heavily and then go back to the newsroom in the afternoon and record your piece. And I just thought, my God, I can't do this.
I got it. I sort of tried to bring a little bit of that culture when I was a producer at Newsnight. So I coined something, and it wasn't at lunch, it was like 5 o'clock. I coined something. It became, I used to get everybody to go to the pub. It became known as GCHQ, or Goodall's Cocktail Hour. And I don't know what the Q stood for, and questions. So the questioning where we were. But yeah, and then that sort of got back to the bosses and they stopped that. But I tried to bring some of that John Sopel spirit back in the mid-2010s.
But I think that is the huge difference, that people would go out for lunch. Now people just sit with a sandwich on their desk and a can of fizzy drink.
Well, I might actually skip ahead slightly because I actually think there's a question related to that. So it says, this is from, it says, "Hi, newsagents. This is from Luke in Cheshire. I'm currently doing a sports journalism course at university. From a journalistic perspective, how and when did you go about making significant contacts in Westminster and elsewhere at the beginning of your careers? Will be good to talk about how you gain contacts in Westminster, John, how that's changed from the environment. Lewis gained contacts, lunches, drinks, etc." I suppose that's right? Is that when you were in the lobby, because when I was in the lobby, several half century later or so, it was probably completely different. There's so much less of the lunch culture now than there was.
Oh, really?
Then. Yeah, I mean, it's still there a bit, but it's so much more Spartan as well. So much less if you do it. So quite unlikely anyone drinks. I mean, maybe some of the more old school ones will, but generally speaking, it's sort of water. It's become a lot more Spartan. On contacts now, I think so many contacts, political contacts, actually now get built up when you almost never meet. It's all over WhatsApp. That's how it is now. I mean, that's huge change. Most of the time I was in the lobby, it was nearly all, and now, talking to political sources and so on, it's nearly all. They prefer it that way because they're so busy and they have so many more pressures. I think the days are so much more condensed and intense, and their principals, their politicians have got so much more to do. That it's just much easier for them. Now if a source wants to get something out, or they want to, so often they will, if they want you to look at something or see a tweet or basically say you should have a look at this, they'll send it out on a little list to all their favourite journalists, over WhatsApp, and try and get you to jump on it.
I'm afraid we were in the age of brown paper envelopes that would just be quietly left on at the dining on the table next to you, and you think, oh, what's he left? Oh, wow, that's interesting. Didn't know that. I just on the good luck with your sports journalism course. Wherever you meet somebody, think of them as a potential source of information. And get their number, try to befriend them, and try to get information. The problem I always found was when someone tells you something, I couldn't believe how indiscreet people would be at these lunches, where they would tell you astonishing things. And I took the view, can we report this or can we not report this? Well, obviously we can't report with the name because it's off the record. But I think I always took the view that if you want to keep a secret, don't tell a journalist. We're not in the business of keeping secrets. We're in the business of giving out information.
Yeah, I mean, and there's one advantage over WhatsApp versus lunch, is that at least you can remember what they said over WhatsApp, which is always, for me, I've always found rather tricky just to remember what people have said at lunch. And this one here is from Danielle, who says, "Dear newsagents, congratulations on your first anniversary. I'm a proud member of the 100%ers Club, meaning I haven't missed a single episode. I moved from the US to the UK shortly after the newsagents started, and your show has been an invaluable crash course on British politics and culture as I've settled into life on the other side of the pond. As for a question, all I really want to know who is each of your favourite US presidents is." Oh, yeah, come on, now we're talking. "And why? I look forward to your coverage of both the UK and US elections in 2024. And of course, Emily was not going to resist a chance to weigh in on this one.
Okay, so my favourite US president. My favourite US president is probably Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, he has obviously the greatest name, but he was also an incredibly hopeful president, and obviously he was president in the years after the crash in 1929, the Great Depression, and he was this massive doer. He got shit done. He did loads of executive orders. He drove through the New Deal, the Tennessee Valley Authority, all these kind of social works things. And he acted like a man who was kind of running out of time. The only US president to serve 4 terms. So yeah, I think he was quite an impressive one.
There we go. FDR. Good choice.
You haven't said where Emily is now.
Well, she's still in the boot, of course.
No, but whereabouts is she on the journey? Because so far,
she'll just be coming up to coming up to the Dartford Tunnel at this point now.
So
up to the Dartford
this
Tunnel.
podcast has been recording over the space of half an hour, and according to Lewis, she's gone from Orléans to the Peripherique to Calais to Dover, and now she's in the Dartford
She's in
Tunnel.
a private jet, of course.
She's going at 240 miles an hour,
Yeah.
according to you.
Yeah. She's in the Maitlis private jet. That's the only way she travels, as you know, John. Getting her in a car on the motorway. Oh dear.
Okay, who are your
Bourgeois.
favourite presidents?
I think my favourite president is probably... You know what? I think it's John Adams.
Right.
I love John Adams. John Adams is second president, first vice president. And he is kind of the forgotten founding father in a way. Partly because he was quite unpopular in his own time. He used to be called His Rotundity because he was very fat and was very grand, because he had this idea that the president should be called His Highness, which Washington didn't like very much. But he was, like so many of those, the founding fathers, he was absolutely brilliant. You know, he was genuinely a sort of steeped in the Enlightenment. He wrote the Massachusetts Constitution, which is I think pretty much the oldest working constitution anywhere in the world. He was completely steeped in letters. He was the first American ambassador to the UK. He had this amazing relationship with his wife, Abigail Adams, and his treasure trove of letters, which is basically a kind of historical document because they were away so much because he was in France trying to get support during the Revolutionary War from the French. And he was, I mean, as Benjamin Franklin said, the revolution wouldn't have happened without him because he was from Massachusetts, which is obviously at the absolute centre of the revolution, the Boston Tea Party. He was basically the guy who represented Massachusetts in the Continental Congress and argued that this was all over and it needed to be done. And I think he was just... And also, the other reason that he's brilliant is because, for 2 reasons. One, he's a founding father, and although Jefferson and Washington, they get all the credit, they were both slavers, particularly Jefferson, of course. Adams was always an abolitionist. And secondly, he was the first president, of course, who, when he lost an election, he gave up and went home, which in 1800, when he lost to Jefferson, which in many ways shouldn't be considered to be an extraordinary thing. But as we see now, it's an extraordinary thing. And it was even more extraordinary then because it had literally never happened before that anywhere on earth someone had lost an election and willingly gave up power as a result.
I suppose the glib answer from me would be, well, my favourite president is Donald Trump because, my God, he's kind of been fantastic for career-wise over the past few years. 3 books, endless reports, and we still keep on going on Donald Trump.
Happy to help, Jan. Happy to help.
But I think that an obvious choice would be Obama because he was such an iconic president and the first African American to be president. I think I'm going to go for LBJ because I think that LBJ is such an interesting president because it was so unexpected. You know, he was this sort of rough Texan who was the vice president to John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy gets assassinated. He becomes sworn in as president on kind of Air Force One on the tarmac at Dallas Airport, and becomes this president that then enacts civil rights legislation, which caused huge resentment in the South from which he came, and actually which cost the Democrats, upended the political map in a way of
and
America.
He knew that. He knew it when
and
he
he
did
knew
it.
it would with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and he saw that through. And I also think there's something else that's interesting about LBJ, which was the kind of slogan as, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And that was his involvement in the Vietnam War. And that for all that LBJ was socially incredibly progressive in an awful lot of what he enacted when he was president in the 1960s, he is remembered for Vietnam. And I wondered, with Tony Blair, for all the social change that he brought about, civil partnerships, minimum wage, Sure Start, etc., whether history will judge him for the Iraq War and not for everything else. And that kind of sense of, in politics, you're remembered for one thing. And LBJ is not remembered he's remembered for Vietnam, but not remembered perhaps as much for some of the really extraordinary social progress that was made with the war on poverty and the like.
Well, and he was just the most consummate politician probably in the last 100 years.
Completely.
And 2 people who perhaps that necessarily can't be said for are Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And David Mitchell's question, which I think we're going to end on, David says, love the pod. I don't know if it's the David Mitchell. I mean, who knows? Where do you see Rishi Sunak ending up in the next decade? And where do you see Keir Starmer ending up in the next decade? Mischievous question, David.
That's a great question. Well, I mean, let's take it that where will Keir Starmer be in 2033 and where will Rishi Sunak be in 2033? If Rishi Sunak loses the election, he's gone.
We won't see him for dust.
We won't see him for dust, and possibly he'll be living in California. He'll be renewing his green card, and all of that.
We'll see way more of Truss over the next decade than we will Sunak if he loses the next election.
Yeah, and I think the challenge for Starmer will be, if you are inheriting an economy that is in a mess, and you've got very tough decisions to make, how you win a second term. Yeah. And I think that will be the challenge for Keir Starmer. It's all very well getting to be Prime Minister, but if it's in the most unpropitious circumstances, is unpropitious a word? Non-propitious. Can't remember. Can't think.
Doesn't matter.
It's only a podcast.
Our birthday show.
It's our birthday. We'll get away with anything.
Yeah.
Then I think that it will be really hard for Starmer to win again at a second general election. And the Tories will regroup. And as we know, and we've seen in history, the Conservatives are a very effective machine of government.
Yeah. Blair had that. Blair had a thing he wrote about in his memoir, in his book, about the different types of Labour governments, and that, there aren't that many of them. But he said that his analysis running up to 97 is you basically had three different types of Labour oppositions. You had one that was never going to win, which he cited as a sort of Michael Foot. That you had one which he would have said, I think he was basically saying would have been like John Smith maybe, or
one more heave,
and that would win because of just pure unpopularity and attrition, but then wouldn't sustain. Because it's easy to forget now that, before Blair there had never been a full two-term Labour government, which is just sort of mind-blowing when you consider how many Conservative ones there have been. And the challenge that he saw it was to craft and create a political project that would sustain in a way that had never happened with the Labour Party before. And I think that is the sort of big open question for Starmer. It doesn't feel like there's much chance that he won't be Prime Minister in some form. So in 2033, he presumably won't be there, but certainly by 2025 or 2026, he's going to be Prime Minister. The question is whether it can sustain and whether the thinking is going on in order to have a political project which is like New Labour in the sense that it can be a long-term one, when all, as we know, with Labour, so many of the factors are against you. And one thing I think is definitely certain is that Blair, and you'll remember this, John, I'm sure, but Blair probably had the longest political honeymoon of any incoming Prime Minister in history. Went on for years, really. Probably arguably went on until certainly the petrol strikes, Iraq, to some extent. He went back in 2001, certainly up to the 2001 election, arguably, or certainly the petrol strikes, which was, 3 years? Starmer's probably going to, I'd be surprised if it lasts 3 months.
Yeah.
And that is going to be a huge political challenge for him.
I mean, if you remember, Blair had a pretty kind of dangerous moment pretty soon after becoming with the whole Bernie Ecclestone thing.
Well, that's true.
But... And he just said, look, I'm a pretty straight kind of guy.
Yeah.
And he got away with that. And you think, I don't think many politicians would be able to say that with a straight face and yet, carry the public with them. And they were very forgiving over that. Less so over some of the things that came later. We've got one more question still to come. We'll pick that up after the break. So, welcome back. Although, as it was Ross Anderson who pointed it out earlier. Why do you always go to the breaks with the words, when we come back, we'll be discussing, and then after the ads, you say, welcome back. We haven't been anywhere. Happy birthday. Carry on. Best regards, Ross Anderson.
Well, it's banned now. We're not going to do it again, Ross.
So
we've had a policy change.
Not welcome back. We're still here.
We're still here.
And so are you. We're still here, and so are you. We've had loads in about Trump and whether he will actually go to jail. So we thought we'd answer by telling you to listen to the Newsagents USA. Is it possible? Yeah, of course it's possible.
Do you think that, presumably there will be people who listen to every one of our normal shows and every one of the US shows? The double 100%ers, the 200%ers.
The 200%ers.
Yeah.
That would be the special.
Elite.
That would be the kind of diamond-tipped badge.
A weekend in Margate with Jon Sopel to all those people. One more question. When will we get any live dates? Warmest regards, Molly. Well, Molly, we can say, just watch this space. We'll update you as soon as you'll be the first to know.
We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for being with us this past year. See you.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.